Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
This episode of Dental Business RX is part 2 of a 2-episode series about hygiene department growth and how to fix an underperforming hygiene department. In last week's episode, which was part 1 or episode 45, we looked at the reasons why so many hygiene departments underperform, along with how you would go about evaluating the strength of your hygiene department, sort of how to determine where you are and what you'd have to fix. Now, this is important as you have to know where you're beginning. So if you missed last week's episode, I definitely recommend that you go back and check it out. And you may want to do it before you listen to this one. Now, it's not a requirement. So if you want to just roll ahead or you've listened to episode 1, what we're going to talk about this week is we're going to roll into the specific steps you take to build the hygiene department up, add days, and so on. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And let's start off with some fundamentals. 5 fundamentals for any dental practice with regards to hygiene department existence, if not growth. And then we'll get into action items to build things up, reactivate patients, and so on. So what are these 5 fundamentals? The first one, many of you already have in place, which is you have to actually employ a hygienist. I understand that hygienists are expensive right now and they're difficult to find, but I've seen it where you'll have doctors who don't want to spend that money and they're doing their own hygiene. Long term, that doesn't work if you're doing your own hygiene. You're never going to be as productive as you potentially could be if you're chairside doing, dental procedures. Now, I know it's tough again finding a hygienist. There's always you can always get an associate to do hygiene if you need to. And if you have a small, brand new office, you're starting from scratch, you wouldn't obviously start from day one with a hygienist if you had 0 volume. You'd maybe build up to the point where maybe you had at least the equivalent of 1 day of hygiene a week, maybe 8 to 10 hygiene patients during the week on your schedule. Then you might add a hygienist, but you have to be judicious about this. If that's all the volume you have, I wouldn't bring a hygienist in until it starts to make it difficult for you to do dentistry. So you have to employ a hygienist. It's not a long-term successful solution to be doing your own hygiene. I've never seen it work long-term. Fundamental number 2, lack of capacity is not a good thing. If a patient of record it takes 6 months for a patient of record to get an appointment on your hygiene schedule and you think that's good, we're booking way out in advance, that is not a good thing. That's something that you don't want to have happening. You want to make sure that if I call your office and I'm a regular patient, I can get in at least within the next, 2 to 3 weeks max. Also, you should obviously have new patient blocks if you have this going on. What you want to do is think like a consumer. Right? Think like a consumer. If you were to call a business and it took X amount of time for you to get something from that business, how would that make you feel? Would it make you think about going elsewhere? Because lack of capacity is going to stifle growth, especially, I've talked about this with regards to new patients before. If a new patient calls your office, you should be able to get them in. And I'm talking about a new patient initial, not a new patient emergency. You should be able to get them in 24 to 48 hours. And whether you see new patient initials on hygiene or the doctor's schedule, it really doesn't matter because the doctor is going to have to eventually do an exam. That is a personal preference for you, but they have to be able to be gotten in within 24 to 48 hours. And I know some people might be listening to that going, well, 24 to 48 hours, I don't have that time available. That's a problem. That's a problem. Because keep in mind, if I call your practice and I'm a new patient, unless I'm referred, I don't really have a relationship with you. So I'm testing you out. If I call your office and I want to come in for, I'm new to the area, I want to get my teeth cleaned, and it's going to take me 3 weeks to get into your office, I might make the appointment, but then I'm probably calling other offices or asking people that I know if they have any other recommendations for a dentist because it's too long. You have to get them in 24 to 48 hours, I would say, with a new patient. I think with a patient of record, this is completely arbitrary. I'm just giving you my own opinion on this. 2 to 3 weeks max would be the max amount of time I would want to see it take for a person to get on the schedule for a cleaning. All right. So just be aware of this because when you hit that point where you're months and months and months, or even like a month, 2 months, 3 months booked out, you probably have to add days. All right. Next point is obvious. Point number 3, fundamental number 3 is pre-schedule someone's next appointment. I say this and it's obvious and it's sort of a thing that has been known The hygienist can do it, or obviously whoever's doing the schedule should check it. But everybody should be scheduled. The last thing you want is someone walking out of the practice and not being in the appointment book. As a matter of fact, if you want to see if this is a situation in your practice, you can grab your practice software and you look at who look at the total number of charts you have, and then ask for a report of how many patients have a next appointment after today. After today, we don't count today. And that number is usually, whenever I've had somebody do this, it's a number that's relatively appalling. You might find you have 4,000 patients and you only have 500 or 800 or 900 scheduled after today. That means 80% of your practice is inactive or doesn't have a next appointment. So you always have to schedule that next appointment, and you have to have some type of, you might be using software, you might be doing postcards, however you want to do it, to inform patients their hygiene appointment is coming up. I'm sure you have some form of a confirmation system. We have ideas on that too. In our scheduler training on DDS Success, we talk about this. But you want to have some form of confirmation in place, obviously, to confirm these patients, but everybody has to get scheduled because, I leave the office, I say I'm going to call you, well, then you try calling me, I try calling you, we don't reach each other, and then a month or two goes by. That becomes a couple years really fast, and then you're deactivating me. So not what you want to do. That's number 3. Number 4, ensure your hygienist is a good fit. Now, I mean that clinically and otherwise. All right. You wouldn't work with a doctor that was continually upsetting patients and didn't get along with people, or that did bad dentistry. That still applies to a hygienist. They're a provider. So if you're not happy with your hygienist's clinical performance, see if you can fix it. If it's something that you can't fix, you're going to have to get another hygienist. You also want to make sure that you get along with them and have a good working relationship, and that they're doing what is required of a hygienist in your practice. For instance, let's say, and you usually find this out during the interview process, but I've had people complain to me that, my hygienist doesn't want to help with case presentations, or patient education. Well, obviously that's an upset because that's something that you want, but they don't want to do. And that's a problem because was that ever explained to them as a requirement? Maybe it wasn't. So if that's a requirement in your office, if I'm your hygienist and you're expecting me to talk to patients, educate patients about oral health or home care or whatever it is you want me to do, or help with sales, you ask, how long have you been missing that tooth? Have you ever thought about getting an implant? If this is what you want me to be doing, I need to agree to that. And if I don't agree to that, and that's just something that's a problem for me, well, maybe I'm not a good fit for your practice. So I have to meet your standards clinically. We have to have a good working relationship, and I have to fit the other requirements of the job as well. Number 5, as far as fundamentals go, is if your hygienist is seeing new patients, ensure that they're clear on exactly how you want these new patients handled. Any sequences, first do this, first do that, then do this. Any rules related to this should be put in a policy format. I bring a patient in, this is what I do, and then I'm taking x-rays first, then I'm doing perio program. Whatever it is you want me to do should be in writing with new patients. You could also apply this to recall patients too. You want this done with every recall patient that comes into your practice. So those are the 5 fundamentals. These are sort of what we're going to build off of. So let's say you've evaluated your hygiene department and you realize we need work. We're only seeing 20, 30, or 40 recall patients a week, and we should be seeing, based on the hygiene formula, which I talked about in last week's episode, we should be seeing 90, 100, 120. So what are we going to do? Well, at its most basic, what we're going to do is, 1, we have patients that need to be brought back in. That's point number 1. And point number 2, as we bring patients back in, or let's say we're doing marketing and we're bringing in new patients and we see new patients in hygiene. As we do that, we're bringing more people back in the practice, we're increasing the volume. So we're going to have to add hygiene days. So how do we go about this? I am a bigger fan of working to increase the volume first rather than increasing capacity. All right. So the sequence is increase volume, then increase capacity, versus the other way around. Why is that? Because what you don't want to do is go, well, I really need another day of hygiene. I realize that potentially I should have 12 days and I only have, 5. So I'm going to hire some hygienists. You hire hygienists and you have nobody calling people in to get those hygienists full. You're going to have people sitting around, meaning hygienist providers, making $60+ an hour doing nothing. So I'd rather have the problem that I have volume and I need to add hygiene days, and then I start adding those even if I have to temp it out. I'd rather do it that way first rather than hiring somebody with nothing to do. So what would this look like? I want to build this hygiene department. I'm going to give you 9 steps to build your hygiene department. They're not as simple as they sound. They're not difficult to do, but they're a little long, these steps. I'm going to give you 9 steps to build the department, and then I'm going to go over a couple ideas on how to add days, the actual mechanical aspects of adding a day. All right, so what's step number 1? The first thing you have to do is you have to make someone responsible for building the hygiene department. Someone has to agree, this is mine, I own this. If you look at a conventional dental practice, they may have 3 people at the front desk, and they're all called, quote unquote, front desk people. But nobody is the schedule coordinator or the financial coordinator and so on. So what happens is everybody does a little bit of everything, right? So if everybody is responsible for something, who is actually responsible? Nobody is. So in this case, we want one person that this is their job. They are going to build our hygiene department. It might be a hygienist who says, I'm going to take on this responsibility. Doesn't mean they're making all the phone calls, but they're the boss of this project. You might even want to, if you're going to do it with your hygienist, you might even give them some form of a financial incentive. If we get from 4 days to 6 days to 10 days, etc., you get an extra couple bucks or whatever. It might be a non-hygienist. It might be a hygiene coordinator. Whatever it is, it has to be a singular person who's ultimately responsible. Of course, other people are going to help, but this is their job. They're accountable. They own it. That's number 1. Number 2, we have to make this a big deal in your practice. So we have a couple of issues here. Number 1, the idea of marketing. When you hear about marketing with relation to dentistry, I'm sure the first thing that conjures up is marketing for new patients. Very few dental practices market to their existing patient base. They just don't. But if you look at what is marketing, what's the purpose of marketing? It's to get people to, want to buy something. That's essentially what the purpose of marketing is. You watch a TV ad and it's a cool car and it makes you want to go look at that car or buy that car. That's the whole point of marketing. Well, you have things that you want to sell. You want new patients, and you also have things that you want your existing patients that you want to sell your existing patients so that they may want to buy. So marketing applies to new patients as well as patients of record. That's the first thing. The second thing is, recall in a dental practice is really not made that big of a deal. If I walk around the average practice in the U.S. or Canada, I'll see signs for Invisalign. I'll see signs for tooth whitening, Zoom tooth whitening, whatever. I'll see signs if you're doing Vivos. I'll see signs for Vivos, sleep apnea, or whatever. In your practice, they'll have a little promo that they give you, right? But there's nothing about checkups or getting regular checkups or regular hygiene appointments. It's not marketed or pushed at all. It's not made a big deal, and it really should be. We talked about why last week, how important this volume is and how this is your growth statistic for the practice. So how do we make this a big deal? There's a few things that we would do. The first thing we do is craft a mission statement for your practice. Now, I may have said that and you go, mission statement. The mission statement, really, the whole purpose of our mission statement is to explain, it's something that you can share with your staff as well as your patients. And, it might be, you're there to, and obviously write it in a way that is accessible to people who may not understand health, function, and aesthetic or whatever. But the basic concept, and obviously this has to be individualized, but it might be that your mission is to restore health, aesthetic, and function and, restore a patient's dental health entirely and then help to maintain it so that they keep their teeth for the rest of their life. And because when people keep their teeth, they live longer. It also improves the quality of their life. That's what you're doing. So the reason you want them seen regularly in hygiene, this is kind of the message, is to A, make sure that you pick up small problems before that they become larger. B, that you maintain their oral health and keep their teeth clean and their gums in good shape. And C, to make sure that any restorations that you do stay good. It's almost like you're working yourself out of a job a little bit. They come in, you fix them up. They come in for regular hygiene appointments and take care of themselves at home. And the restorations that you do last longer or could last for a real long time. So that's the message you want to communicate to your entire patient base. You could even educate new patients on this. Tell them a little bit about your office and what your mission is in the office. My mission is to fully restore your dental health and maintain your dental health. So it's important that you come back every 3 to 6 or 4, whatever recall schedule you're going to put them on. And this is why. Okay? So everybody should be thinking with this. This is something that you and the hygienist are reiterating every time you're seeing a patient in recall. Don't forget, make sure you come back for your next checkup. It's important. Here's why. Don't forget. Because there's an interesting thing with marketing and public relations. If you can think of any product that, if you think of a specific product, like we all know, for insurance, we know Geico, right? With the gecko, where they had the different campaigns that they did. Why do we know Geico? Because we saw continuous commercials and messaging, and there was stuff, if you ever listened to the radio, I don't anymore, but radio stuff, billboards, things at the airport. There was just stuff everywhere. The more you repeat a message, the more you continuously just, boom, 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 the more it really begins to hit home. So repetition is important in this regard. So we want every single patient in your patient base thinking with this, that it is important that I show up regularly, and here's why. The next thing is you want your staff fully on board with this. So one thing you can do, and we've recommended this before in a number of different ways, there's this idea of the lunch and learn. You order lunch in, you have your entire team there, and you can go over certain things. So you want your entire staff to be knowledgeable as to why it's important for patients to keep their hygiene appointments. You explain to them, what happens when a person has gum disease, how it can affect their overall health, what you're actually physically doing during a hygiene appointment, and so on. You could also explain dental procedures the same way. This is why it's important to replace a missing tooth. This is what a crown is and why we do one and how we do one. And you could do this as a series. You do a lunch and learn once a month, and I would record these. You've never been in an era where it's been easier to train people. This is the easiest era ever to train people because you have all kinds of media at your fingertips. You can, for $40, you can buy a tripod that you can put an iPhone on and record. And you save all these videos in a centralized location, not on your iPhone, so that they're easy to access for everybody, so that you do these little lunch and learns with your entire team. And if you have any turnover or as you expand, you bring in new staff, you can have them watch these videos. But keep in mind, who do your patients speak to? Your staff. So, and you also want them thinking with this. So for you, if a patient told you that they were going to blow off their hygiene appointment, you would explain to them why that's a bad idea, right? Because you're a doctor, or, if you're a hygienist, you would explain, no, that's a bad idea. Here's why. Well, you want everybody in the office thinking that way. So I'm not only calling people to schedule them or handling them so that they don't cancel, but I know why it's important to do that. You want every single team member. Also keep in mind, your staff Also, keep in mind your patients ask your team questions. The doctor's talking to me about replacing this tooth with an implant. What do you think? Your staff should be able to tell the person, yeah, it's important, and actually really believe it and know why. So definitely train the staff up on this. Then any practice outreach from that you're doing, any kind of outreach, newsletters, signs around the office, and so on, any promotion that you're doing to patients of record should continue to slam this message in of, don't forget to make your next, if you don't have your next hygiene appointment scheduled, call right now to get it scheduled. It's very important. Okay, you might even have a link at the end of emails, promotion and any statements that go out other than past due statements. You want to make this a regular message. You might have little placards around the office of signs, make sure that you have your next hygiene visit. It could be at the end of letters, emails, etc. But you want this continuously in people's face that it's important that they keep their hygiene appointment within reason. You don't want it to be ridiculous, like every square inch of your practice is plastered with this, but give it as much attention as you give Invisalign or Vivos or whatever else you might be marketing in the office. All right, now you could take the next couple steps. I would do it if you have social media channels that you operate on, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc. I would do promotional videos, or at least videos as to, why it's important to keep your hygiene visits, why it's important to manage or control gum disease, how it leads to systemic health problems. You might do videos when you have a new hygienist and introduce them, things like this. And it would give some type of a call to action at the end of these videos. So call today and make sure, if you don't have your next checkup scheduled, call today and get on the schedule as soon as possible. You want to basically reiterate why it's important to keep these appointments, as well as if I'm a patient of record out there watching and I don't have my next appointment, that I call and make it. And you could even, if you wanted to, I've seen a few people do this. You could have let's say you have a patient and they have never missed a hygiene appointment in 10 years or 7 years or 18 years or whatever. You could have them make a testimonial video. It's not unusual to have patients make testimonial videos with the before and afters. You just did a full mouth restoration and you look at the before and after and the patient gives a little success story on your Facebook page as to what it did for them. You could do it for this too. Yeah, I've never missed a hygiene appointment in the last 10 years. And I want to tell you, it's really important because there are some problems. I knew I had this one problem. It was just a filling. If I hadn't done that, because it's happened to me before I was a patient, I let that go. And then I ended up needing a crown. So it saved me money, improved the quality of my life, whatever the patient wants to say. But it's something that you're actively promoting. All right. So again, remember, the important thing is that everywhere I look with relation to your practice, I'm seeing this message amongst any other messages that I'm seeing. Hygiene is being made a big deal. That's the whole point. All right. So we've made it a big deal. We've made somebody responsible. We've educated the staff and we're educating every patient that's coming in. So now we need to start getting people back in. So we need to do some patient reactivation. All right, because, we're only seeing 30 recalls a week and we should be seeing 100. We're losing $500,000 a year. So this really, how you do this and what you're going to do really depends on your individual situation. But let's kind of run through this a little bit. In last week's episode, I gave you an example of a practice that was only seeing 31 recalls a week when they should have been seeing 96. It was losing $500,000 a year. We figured that out using the hygiene formula. All right, so you're losing $500K a year. And there's, 2,000 patients that need to be called in. Would it be worth hiring somebody full time to chase these patients back in? I think it would be. I think it would be to chase a couple thousand patients and I have 500,000 in lost revenue and I hire a full-time employee that maybe I'm paying 40 to 45,000 a year. Yeah, the numbers work. And if I have somebody that I hire that's good and they recover, 80% of these patients, well, then my hygiene is going gangbusters. And that's not to mention the clinical work you're going to find in those hygiene patients. So it's not just 500 you're losing in hygiene. You're losing all the potential dentistry there as well. But that person, if they can pull that off and, we don't need somebody to do reactivation full time anymore, I'm sure if they're that good, I'll find something else for them to do. Maybe they become the hygiene coordinator at that point and they're just coordinating my 12 to 15 days of hygiene a week now and keeping them filled. There's always going to be something you can find to do for somebody that's good, but I'm going to have them doing reactivation continuously. This is their job. It's full time. Now, in addition to that, because again, I mentioned it really depends on your situation. Let's say I only have 400 or 500 patients that are inactive. Well, then I don't need to hire somebody full time. I might also have software that helps me with this, the different types of software that do reactivation texts and things like that. So you have to assess sort of, how big of a problem is it and how many hours would it take in a given day to actually cycle through all these patients to get them back, and how much potential revenue am I losing and how much would I have to pay this person? It's sort of like a little bit of an equation you do in your head. And if it works, then it's definitely it's worthwhile bringing somebody in. You might bring somebody in part-time or full-time. But now, in addition to that, what I'm going to do if I have a reactivation in charge, I'm also going to get the rest of the staff, assuming we have the resources to do this, to do what we call, we have a term here we use, which is, an all hands activity, ALL dash or space hands, meaning everybody. All hands jump in to help. So I don't know if you've ever had this before. Maybe you have a big project that has to get done. You have a bunch of letters that have to go out, 600 letters, and 5 or 6 people from the team all get together at once and they get it done in, 20 minutes versus if you had one person closing envelopes it would take them hours. So that's an all hands. Everybody jump in and do something. Well, you would do the same thing with relation to reactivation, especially if it's a big problem. You might have several staff spend an hour a week flat out on reactivation. Maybe your financial coordinator, your schedule coordinator, a couple of the dental assistants might do it. A hygienist might even spend an hour a week on the phone. Obviously, I'd want to make sure they were decent on the phone first. Otherwise, it's way too much to be spending to put somebody on the phone. But in addition to the reactivation person who's calling out, I'm going to have the other staff jump in to also help out. And then this inevitably leads to the question, how often is too often to contact somebody? All right, so a couple of points here. If you're going to embark on a big reactivation thing, I would definitely recommend that you download the MGE reactivation program. It's a series of steps that help you reactivate patients, including letters that you might send out. I'll put a link on the episode webpage if you want to download this thing, the MGE reactivation program. But it also tells you what letters to send out and how often. All right. But with relation to phone calls, this is sort of a judgment call. How often is too often to call? How often is too often to call? I mean, I can give you my own assessment of that. If someone called me because I was overdue for a hygiene appointment, let's say they called me on a Monday, and then they called me again on Friday or the following Monday or maybe Thursday, 4 to 6 days later, or probably not that big of a deal. If they called me like every day, that might seem a bit excessive. Being called every day or multiple times in a day, that could seem excessive. I would say maybe once a week, once every 4 to 5 days. So when you're looking at sort of the estimation of what is it going to take to reactivate your patient base, think with that. You have to I want everybody to get a phone call, let's say once a week. All right? So who's overdue? And I have 3,000 patients that are overdue. So that means I need 3,000 phone calls a week. Because if I'm calling them once every 2 months, that's not frequent enough. If I'm calling them once a month, that's probably also not frequent enough. Once every 2 weeks might work, but let's say I want them called once a week. Until they respond, obviously, then I'm not going to keep calling them. Well, if I have 3,000 inactive patients, 3,000 phone calls a week if we're open 4 or 5 days, that's 500 to 750 calls a day. That might be 2 full-time people, you see? Because how many people is one person going to call? So this is what I'm saying. When you're calculating what you need to do this, those are some of the things that you're going to want to look at. All right. The other thing, too, is the staff should be educated that any time they're speaking to a patient, I don't care if the patient's calling for directions, an insurance question, it doesn't really matter. Back to school question, do I have to get my kid an exam for this or whatever? Any time a person calls the practice, that is a patient, their hygiene status is always checked. Always, invariably. Do they have their next hygiene appointment? And if they don't, that appointment gets made. All right? And so I know this is a lot, but that's the type or the activity level we're talking about. I mentioned in the last week's episode that very little time or effort is spent keeping patients in the practice, but we spend all kinds of money to get in new patients. Those are the kind of efforts you want to do to maintain an active patient base. Now, the cool thing about this is you'll notice the only thing that costs you money out of the stuff I just described beyond a couple of posters is employees. If you have to have employees doing this, but those employees' productivity are going to be directly convertible into more patients into the practice. So this is something that I would definitely put some effort towards. And that's the type of activity level we're looking for. All right. And the next point I would go over here is we need to keep metrics as to how we're actually doing. Now, I mentioned in last week's episode, there's a very important metric, which is your practice growth statistic, and that is number of recall visits. This would be 3, 4, like a perio maintenance, 4 or 6 month recalls in a given week, month, etc. Number of recall visits, not number of hygiene visits. You can keep that number if you want, but that doesn't tell me if hygiene is growing, especially if you have a soft tissue management program or you're seeing new patients in hygiene. So I want number of recall visits. That number should be growing every month, 2 months, 3 months, especially if we're doing a lot of reactivation activity. That should be growing very, very fast if we're bringing in a bunch of inactive patients. Last week when I went over the numbers, I showed you how a practice getting 30 new patients a month should be adding 1.4 days of hygiene per week per year. If I had 4 days last year, if I get 30 new patients a month, next year I should have 5.5, right? So that tells you the practice is growing and we're retaining patients. We're not losing them. They're not coming in the front door and going out the back. So this is a key metric. I would keep it weekly, monthly, quarterly, and you want to see this number growing over time. If this number isn't growing, something is very wrong. All right. So then the last point I would go over has to do with productivity more than hygiene department growth, but it is important in its own right. And it has to do with guidelines for the hygienist, clinical guidelines for the hygienist. This is something that the doctor has to put in policy form for the hygienist. Let me explain to you where this becomes a problem. So let's say I go into the practice and, I'm overdue for a year. And, I've got a lot of tartar and my mouth's a bit of a mess, right? And the hygienist is essentially doing a gross debridement, a gross scale. But the hygienist doesn't differentiate between a prophy and a gross scale. Now, you have a different fee for a gross scale and a prophy. They're different procedures. But in some cases, a hygienist will look at that and go, oh, well, I'll just do a really deep cleaning on their teeth, and they charge for a prophy. All right? Now, you might wonder, what's the big deal about that? Well, you're costing yourself revenue. The hygienist is costing themselves production. And truthfully, it's a lot more work than if I came in every three months, 6 months, or whatever, and I'm taking care of myself. You don't have to go through all that to clean my teeth. So you want to make sure you lay out guidelines. This would be the guidelines. This would be a gross scale. If these conditions are met when the patient presents, this is a gross scale. This would most likely require scaling and root planing. Obviously, the doctor has to diagnose this personally, but then the hygienist might look at the patient and tell the doctor or have the doctor pop over and whatever your procedure is for this, and then, okay, tell the patient then, look, we're going to need to do a gross scaling today because you haven't been in for a year and a half. So you want to have guidelines for this stuff if you're going to do any type of perio program, especially as to what constitutes certain levels of perio and various types of actions the office is going to take. All right, so as you reactivate old patients, you retain the new ones you're bringing in, you add more new patients, you build your perio program. Now we need to increase, we're doing this during, of course, but as we're growing, we need to increase availability. We're going to have to add hygiene days. I talked about this a little bit earlier. How far booked out is too far? New patient, it's 24 to 48 hours. I would say with patients of record, it would be 2 to 3 weeks. But if I'm booked out again, I'm booked out a month now, I'm booked out 2 months, etc., I need to add days. So to add a day of hygiene, what am I going to do? Well, I'll give you a basic, simple formula for this. First thing you would do is you would pick a day of the week you plan to add. So let's say the office is open 4 days a week and I only have 3 days of hygiene. Well, obviously I'm going to be adding day 4 then, right? But let's say I've already got 4 days and I want to add day 5. So what I'd probably do is I'd talk to my schedule coordinator or my office manager and I'd say, okay, we've got 4 days of hygiene. If you had to add a second hygienist on one of these days, which would be the easiest to fill? And they may say Tuesdays. Tuesdays are really easy to book. You go, okay, good. Then we're going to add Tuesdays. So when are we going to have our first double hygiene day where we add that Tuesday, day number 5? We're going to go 6 weeks out. All right. So we're booked with the 4 days we have. And we're booked 2 months, 3 months out, and we need to add a day. So we decided Tuesday is the best day to add. So we're going to pick a Tuesday 6 weeks from now and start booking the second hygienist, the double hygiene, on that Tuesday. So we've got the 4 days we're already booking. This is day number 5. We're starting 6 weeks out. Within that 6-week period, while we keep the other 4 days booked, that should be plenty of time to book that other Tuesday as well. And then we need to get somebody to work that Tuesday, so we could look for it. Gives us 6 weeks to find a hygienist who can work 1 day a week, or we can temp it until we can find a hygienist that works 1 day a week, and so on. It's usually not difficult to find a day or a 2-day hygienist, even in this market. All right, so let's say we now have solidly booked those 5 days. The double hygiene on Tuesday plus the Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday are solidly booked, more than 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out, etc. So we're in that same situation again. Now we need to add another hygiene day. All right, so then we would pick the next easiest day to fill. Let's say the next easiest day to fill is Wednesdays. All right, so then 6 weeks from now, we're going to pick the Wednesday and start adding the same exercise we just did for Tuesdays. And then eventually we have those 6 days solidly booked for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. Now we're going to add a 7th day and so on. We just keep repeating this as we add days. Now, if we do this right, we're going to run into some problems. Now, these are not necessarily bad problems, but they're good problems, but these are problems that we have to solve managerially and organizationally. Number one, if we've done this, and let's say we've now got 2 solidly booked 4-day-a-week hygienists, all right, and we're starting to look at adding a third 1-day-a-week hygienist, and it's a solo doc in this office, we're probably going to have to add an associate. I think I've talked about this in other episodes, and I know I've definitely gone over it when I've lectured. ideal ratio, you want to maintain like a 1-to-1 or 1-to-1.5 hygienist to doctor or doctor to hygienist ratio, meaning if you have one doctor, that doctor is managing 1 to 1.5 hygienists. When they're managing two hygienists, it can get a bit tight. There'll be hours where that doctor has to, get up, unglove, wash their hands, reglove, unglove, and so on twice in an hour because he needs to or she needs to do two exams. So when you start pushing two hygienists to one doc, you start to actually lose a degree of productivity and potential on the doctor's schedule. They have less time to sell and things like that. If you've got three hygienists, that doctor is definitely taking a hit in their productivity and potential. So you need to start thinking about, as you start to add more and more hygienists, that you're going to probably need an associate if you can't maintain that 1 to 1.5 ratio. Like I would not run it 1 to 3. It may seem cool and the office is really busy, but that doctor is losing productivity. Now, what if as you do this, you start running out of chair space? You have 4 chairs, you work out of 2, and you've added 2 full-time hygienists. And now you're looking at, wow, we need to add another day of hygiene. Well, I'll tell you what a lot of offices do. They suppress their growth, which I would absolutely not do. I would take a couple of different approaches to this. So let's say this is the situation. I'm a solo doc. I've got 4 chairs and, I've got 2 full-time hygienists cranking out of 2 of them, and I'm working out of the other 2 chairs, and I'm properly double booked and efficiently scheduled. And I'm now need to add more hygiene days. The first thing I would probably do before I added more hygiene days is if I'm participating in a lot of PPOs, I might start dropping some PPOs at this point. If you do it right, you won't lose a lot of patients, but I may lose some. And what I do by dropping these PPOs, I do an immediate overall global fee increase for my practice because you're writing off a ton with PPOs, so I'm increasing my revenues without expending extra time. So that's the first thing I would do. But let's say I don't have this problem. I have no PPOs, or I've dropped most of them, and, the one I have left only takes, I have a 5 to 10% write-off. I know if there was a PPO that did that. We all want to know which one it is. But let's say that's the case. All right, and we're out of 4 chairs, and we're starting to get slammed, and I have no more chair space. I could add another chair, right? I might need to add 2, because I'm probably going to have to add an associate, because I'm about to go to 3 hygienists, right? But I would definitely normalize my fees before I got into this by dropping the PPOs. But let's say I do that, I can add chairs and it's not a problem. Let's say we don't have the ability to add chairs in my space. There's just no more space. I'm in an office building and there's just no more space available. Well, there's 2 options I have at that point. I could either move, which gets really expensive unless I find somebody who has an office they've just built out that they're just getting rid of, and building out a new dental practice can get very expensive. I could move. Or if I don't have the, and I'm not saying don't, there might be opportunities where it's the ideal situation for you, but you want to evaluate that. And I did do an episode on that. I just don't remember the number. Sorry about that as I'm doing this. All right. So you could move, or you could do what we call a split shift. All right. And, I debated whether I wanted to talk about this in this episode or not, but I figured why the heck not? Because I don't want you immediately, potentially messing with your own head about expansion because you're adding tons and tons of more hygiene patients. What you could do if you want to split shifts, and obviously I can't explain all of this just in this one episode, but what is the general concept? Is you're paying for your office 7 days a week, 28 to 31 days a month, 24 hours a day. So in some cases, and maybe you're only working 4 to 4.5 days a week, well, you could have the office open longer. You could add days. I'm not saying that you should add days personally or just have your staff work more. We've had offices where they just run out of space and they can't move or don't want to move, where they'll expand hours and have a second shift working those other hours. So shift 1 might be from 7 to 2. The owner doctor works from 7 to 2, 4 days a week. And then another doctor works from, 2 to 7 or 8 at night, 4 days a week, and then works Fridays. And maybe half a Saturday. You could split the shifts. Essentially, it's like squeezing 2 offices into one place. So then what's great about that is then your expenses for fixed expenses really don't go up. Your rent stays the same. Maybe you pay a little more for the power bill. But the only expenses that increase are variables like staffing, maybe marketing, and your electrical bill and things like that. Now that requires a lot of organizational skill, and this is where you really have to know what you're doing. This is why we have the MGE Power program, where we really get into how to organize your practice, make it more efficient, etc. I'll put a link on the episode webpage here. But usually where you see the headaches with relation to growth or organization is when people don't know exactly how to deal with it or run it. And then it becomes stressful. It creates financial problems because they're making decisions that they shouldn't. Right? But look, let's have that problem first, right? You have too much volume. There's so many hygiene patients. I don't know what to do. Like, that's a great problem to have, right? Let's have that problem first, and then we can worry about the potential headaches of growth and organization. All right. So those are the basic steps. If you have any questions about any of these steps, feel free to email me at jeffb@mgeonline.com. You can also, if you have just questions about, you need help with your practice, you can visit us online at mgeonline.com and click you'd like a free practice consultation. I hope this helped. I definitely urge you to do this. This is a built-in mechanism that you have in your business that other businesses would kill for. The idea that people have to keep coming back, and they should. And, so I would definitely work on this. And if you have any questions about it, let me know. I really appreciate you guys listening. And if you want to give me any feedback, I'd love to see that as well. And if you want more information about MGE, you can also call us at 800-640-1140. Don't forget that the downloads are on the episode webpage if you want access to them. Otherwise, folks, have a great week, and I'll see you at the next episode.